The evening Carla Denning Subaru Outback sat in my driveway with its rear bumper 2 inches from the eastern brick pillar and its front wheels past the center line of the entrance in a position from which the turning geometry required to exit was mathematically incompatible with the Outback's steering lock. I was in my kitchen making dinner and watching the situation on my phone through the camera I had installed at the driveway entrance 6 weeks earlier. And I want to tell you that what I felt in that moment was not satisfaction in the conventional sense, but something more precise, the specific feeling of a transportation engineer watching a system she designed perform exactly as the specifications required under the conditions it was designed to address. My name is Delia Marsh. I am 46 years old, a licensed transportation engineer with 17 years of experience in traffic circulation design, parking system geometry, and site access infrastructure, and I have lived in the Birchwood Commons HOA development in Central Tennessee for 4 years. My husband, James, is a high school history teacher. Our house is a 3-bedroom colonial on a standard lot with a single-car attached garage and a driveway that runs from Millbrook Avenue along the eastern side of the house to the garage door, 47 feet long, 11 feet wide. With a turning apron in front of the garage that I had designed personally when we added the garage extension 2 years ago to provide exactly the turning radius required for my vehicle to execute a 3-point turn in the apron space and exit forward onto Millbrook Avenue. I am telling you about the turning apron design specifically because it is the technical fact that makes everything else in this story coherent. Carla Denning had lived 4 houses west on Millbrook Avenue for 3 years, 2 years longer than I had been in the neighborhood. She was 52, recently retired from a career in insurance claims, and she drove a Subaru Outback in a shade of blue she had described to me on the occasion of our second conversation as autumn green, which I had noted was not a description I would apply to the color, but which was not a dispute worth having. She had 2 dogs and a pleasant manner, and had been using my driveway as a turnaround since approximately my 3rd month in the house, on a schedule that corresponded to her morning departure route and her evening return route, which both required a direction change that my driveway apron accommodated more conveniently than the cul-de-sac 200 feet east on Millbrook Avenue. I had recognized the pattern in month 4 when I began noticing tire marks in my driveway surface after wet weather that were not consistent with my own vehicle's track width or turning pattern. I had installed a basic doorbell camera in month 5 and had confirmed within 2 weeks that Carla was using my driveway as a turnaround 3 to 5 times per week. I want to be clear that I had approached this situation with the patience of someone who understood that not every problem requires immediate escalation. I had knocked on Carla's door in month 6 and explained what I had observed and asked her to use her own driveway or the cul-de-sac. She had been warm and apologetic and had stopped for 12 days. Then the camera showed the Outback in my apron on a Tuesday morning. I had knocked again, same warmth, same apology, stopped for 9 days. I had left a written note on her windshield when I found her in my driveway on a rainy Thursday, stopped for 6 days. I had filed a formal HOA complaint in month 8. The HOA board sent a notice, stopped for 3 weeks. I had retained my attorney, Daniel Cross, in month 10. Daniel had sent a formal letter. Carla had called me after receiving it and said she found it excessive for what she described as a minor neighborhood convenience matter. I had told her that my driveway was my private property and the convenience she was describing was mine to provide or withhold, and I was withholding it. She had said she understood and would stop. She had stopped for 31 days, which was the longest pause in the 18-month pattern, and I had noted the duration with the specific attention of someone tracking a system's response to inputs, because 31 days was different enough from the prior pauses to suggest genuine behavioral change rather than temporary compliance. Then on day 32, the camera showed the Outback in my apron at 7:14 in the morning, and I understood that the 31 days had been a pause rather than a resolution, and that I had been correct to be tracking it carefully. That was the morning I called Daniel and told him I was done with behavioral solutions and was moving to structural ones. I designed the brick pillars that week. The design process was similar to the ones described in other accounts in this collection, but I want to describe my specific parameters because my engineering background produced specifications that differed from a mason's approach in ways I found professionally interesting. The primary specification was geometric rather than structural. I needed pillar placement that achieved two simultaneous objectives. First, the pillars needed to allow my own vehicle, a Toyota Camry with a curb-to-curb turning radius of 34 feet, to execute the three-point turn in my apron and exit forward without contact with either pillar. Second, the pillars needed to prevent a Subaru Outback, which has a curb-to-curb turning radius of 37.5 feet, from executing the same maneuver within the available space. The difference between those two turning radii is 3.5 feet. In the geometry of a fixed entrance width, that difference is sufficient to make one vehicle's turnaround possible and the other vehicle's turnaround impossible, but only if the pillars are placed at the precise offset that captures that difference. If the pillars are placed too far apart, both vehicles can turn. If they are placed too close together, neither vehicle can turn. The correct placement is a narrow band of positions where my Camry's tighter turning radius allows it to clear the constraint that the Outback's wider turning radius cannot. I spent 2 evenings calculating the correct placement. I used my traffic simulation software, the same tool I used for professional intersection designs, modeling both vehicles' turning paths at various pillar positions until I found the range that satisfied both requirements. The correct placement put the eastern pillar offset 7 inches from where a symmetric installation would have positioned it, creating an asymmetric entrance that looked natural to the eye but was precisely calibrated to the centimeter. I hired a local mason named Robert Gaines who had done work for us before and whose execution I trusted. I gave Robert a drawing with exact dimensions. He looked at it and said, "The pillars are not centered." I said, "They are not." He said, "Is that intentional?" I said, "Yes." He looked at the drawing for a moment. He said, "The gap on the east side is narrower." I said, "Yes." He said, "How much narrower matters to you?" I said, "It matters to within a centimeter." He looked at me. He said, "You are an engineer." I said, "Transportation." He nodded slowly. He said, "I will hit your dimensions." He hit them. I checked the installed pillar positions with a total station survey instrument I borrowed from my firm's equipment pool, the same instrument I used for roadway surveys, and confirmed both pillars were within 4 millimeters of the design dimensions. Robert had done precise work, and I told him so, and he said he always did precise work. Between the pillars, I installed a steel gate fabricated by a local metalworker, hinged at the western pillar, padlocked at the eastern pillar, powder-coated in black. The gate was a standard design, nothing elaborate, but correct for the application. The permit had been pulled before construction started. My municipality required a driveway modification permit for permanent structures at the curb cut. I had applied with full drawings, and the permit was issued in 14 days. I activated the installation the day after Robert completed it by closing and padlocking the gate. The pillars and gate were operational. I notified Daniel that the installation was complete. He filed an updated documentation record with the HOA management company, noting the permitted installation and my legal basis for it. The first alert came 2 days after activation, 7:18 in the morning. Carla's Outback at my driveway entrance. She stopped at the gate, which was closed and padlocked, and sat for 40 seconds. Then she reversed and drove to the cul-de-sac and turned around there. I noted it. The second alert came the following morning. Same sequence, longer pause, same resolution, the cul-de-sac. The third alert came 4 days later and was the one I want to describe because it was the one that revealed the specific geometry problem the design had produced. Carla pulled up to the gate at 7:22. She stopped. She looked at the gate for approximately 30 seconds, Then she made a decision I had anticipated as possible but had not been certain she would make. She pulled forward so her front bumper contacted the gate, as though testing whether it would open under pressure. The gate was padlocked and did not open. Then she backed up and attempted a different approach. She pulled into the driveway from a steeper angle, which is the technique drivers use to maximize turning radius within a constrained entrance. Her front left wheel came past the eastern pillar. Her front right wheel was near the western pillar. She was in the entrance at an angle that used the maximum available width. She began to execute what she believed would be the turnaround. The Outback moved forward into the apron. The front cleared the pillars. She began the turning component of the three-point turn. What happened next was what my simulation had predicted. The Outback steering reached maximum lock before the front of the vehicle had completed the arc required to clear the eastern pillar on the return path. She was in the middle of the turn with the front of her vehicle pointing at the eastern pillar and her steering wheel at full lock and insufficient radius to complete the turn without contact. She stopped. She tried to assess the geometry from the driver's seat. She reversed slightly. She tried the turn again at a slightly different approach angle. The result was the same. The physics of her vehicle's turning radius in the available space were not negotiable. I watched all of this on my phone for 22 minutes. Carla tried 7 different approach and turn combinations over those 22 minutes. Each one failed at the same geometric constraint. The Outback's turning radius was 37.5 feet. The available arc within my apron, constrained by the pillar placement, was 34 feet and 2 inches. The gap between what she needed and what was available was 3 feet and 4 inches. This gap did not change regardless of approach angle or technique, because it was a function of the vehicle's physical properties and the spatial geometry, neither of which was variable. On the 8th attempt, she pulled forward far enough that her front right corner was 18 inches from the western pillar and her front left corner was 2 feet from the garage door, and she was out of options in all directions simultaneously. She called me at 7:44. I answered. She said, "I am stuck in your driveway." I said, "You are not mechanically stuck. Your vehicle is functional. You are in a position from which your vehicle's turning radius is insufficient to complete the exit maneuver you are attempting." She said, "Can you help me?" I said, "I can describe the exit sequence. You need to reverse fully out of the apron to the position where your rear bumper is past the eastern pillar on the street side. Then reverse further onto Millbrook Avenue until your entire vehicle is clear of the entrance. Then drive forward. Your vehicle can exit by reversing out. It cannot exit by turning around because the available turning radius is insufficient for your vehicle's geometry." She said, "I have to back all the way out to the street." I said, "Yes, that is the only exit available to your vehicle in the current configuration." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You designed it this way." I said, "I designed an access control installation for my private driveway. The turning geometry is a function of the installation dimensions and the available space." She said, "You designed it so my car, specifically, cannot turn around." I said, "I designed it so my car can use my driveway normally and unauthorized vehicles cannot execute the turnaround maneuver that constitutes the unauthorized use I have been documenting for 18 months. She said, "You knew my car." I said, "I knew the general category of vehicle that was using my driveway. I designed for the turning radius requirements I needed to accommodate for my own use, and the turning radius I needed to exclude for other vehicles." She was quiet for a longer moment. I heard the Outback engine running. She said, "How do I get out?" I said, "Reverse slowly to the street. Keep your wheels straight until you are past the pillars. Once your rear bumper clears the street curb line, you can angle toward the center of Millbrook Avenue. The maneuver will take approximately 4 reversing movements." It took 6, but she got out. I watched the Outback reverse onto Millbrook Avenue and sit there for a moment and then drive west toward her house. I put down my phone and finished making dinner. Daniel filed the expanded civil claim the following week. 18 months of documented incidents, the formal letter, the HOA complaint, the post-installation attempts, and the 22-minute geometric entrapment incident with complete camera documentation and timestamps. He also included my professional engineering analysis of the turning radius design, which I had prepared as a 4-page technical document explaining the geometry and confirming that the installation served my legitimate driveway access needs while producing the secondary effect on unauthorized turnaround attempts. Carla's attorney, a local general practice lawyer named Howard Gaines, called Daniel 2 weeks after the claim was filed. His opening question was whether the driveway modification had been designed specifically to entrap Carla's vehicle. Daniel read him the relevant section of my engineering analysis. The analysis explained that the design was optimized for my vehicle's turning radius and that the exclusion of vehicles with wider turning radii was a consequence of that optimization, not an independent targeting of any specific vehicle. Howard Gaines said she had to reverse out of the driveway in front of her neighbors. Daniel said she was in a private driveway she had no permission to be in. The exit maneuver available to her was reversing out. That is a consequence of the geometry and of her decision to enter a private driveway without authorization. The negotiation took 2 weeks. Carla settled for $11,400, which covered Daniel's fees, my engineering analysis preparation time billed at my professional rate, and compensatory damages for 18 months of documented unauthorized use of my private property. Her homeowner's insurance declined to cover the claim because the sustained intentional conduct was not accidental. The HOA board sent a formal acknowledgement that the installation was a legal permitted structure and that no community standards provision applied to private driveway access control installations with valid municipal permits. Carla has been using the cul-de-sac for the 6 months since the settlement. I watched the camera footage in my monthly documentation review, and it shows nothing but my own vehicle and James's vehicle and the occasional delivery truck that backs in and turns around correctly because delivery drivers are accustomed to navigating constrained driveway geometry. My neighbor Howard Park, the retired architect who appeared in several of these accounts, came over on a Sunday afternoon and stood at the end of my driveway looking at the installation. He looked at the pillar placement for a long time. He said, "The offset." I said, 7 inches east of symmetric. He said, "That is a specific number." I said, "It is the number that places the effective turning arc at 34 feet 2 inches, which is tight clearance for my Camry and insufficient for the Outback." He said, "You calculated it." I said, "Traffic simulation software, 2 evenings." He said, "For a residential driveway." I said, "For the correct solution to a documented problem. The scale of the problem does not change the standard for the solution." He looked at the pillars for another moment. He said, "I have been an architect for 30 years, and I have never seen someone apply traffic circulation design principles to a residential driveway access control problem." I said, "The principles are the same regardless of scale, vehicle dimensions, turning radii, available geometry. The math does not care whether it is a highway interchange or a residential driveway." He said, "The math does not care." I said, "No." He said, "But you do." I said, "I care that the solution is correct. That requires the math." He went home. I went inside. James was at the kitchen table grabbing papers. He looked up and said, "Howard." I said, "He noticed the offset." James said, "Of course he noticed the offset. He is an architect." I said, "He said he had never seen traffic circulation principles applied to a residential driveway." James said, "Had he?" I said, "Apparently not." James said, "Is it the first time you have?" I said, "First time I needed to." He smiled and went back to gradding. I made tea and sat at the table and looked out the front window at the driveway entrance where the pillars stood at their precisely calculated positions in the afternoon light, matching the house brick, supporting the gate that was closed and padlocked, forming a geometric constraint that was calibrated to 4 millimeters and had performed exactly as designed under the conditions it had been designed to address. Everything was correct. Everything was always correct when you applied the right principles at the right scale with the right precision. That was the standard. That had always been the standard. Thumbnail text: she used his driveway 80+ times. A transportation engineer calculated the exact geometry to trap her car. It worked perfectly.